Okay. So then we're on the last question then from this paper, which is the stamp act controversy was probably the most common question on this thing. If you get, I mean, they must have been laughing when they saw this question on there because it's so easy. The stamp act controversy was the most important event in causing the deteriorating relationship between Britain and the colonies in the period from 1763 to 1775. Why do you agree? So obviously you're capping from end of the 7 Years' War until basically the Lexington Concord and the Second Continental Congress. So Stamp Act, obviously, we have to cover because it's the one there, and then we have to pick two others. You would pick two to run out. So which would you pick along with the Stamp Act? Obviously, we've talked about them all before. Where would you go?
You mean in terms of the other events?
Yeah, because you can only redo three factors, and obviously we're able to do we know this question's come up before. We know there's like 9 possible kind of events you can pick. We know you can easily pick the Proclamation Act, Stamp Act, Townsend Duties, Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, Intolerable Acts, or the Quebec Act.
Yeah,
I think with only 3 to choose from, I don't think you'd pick anything else. But if someone wants to have a crack at one of the others, they can. But Stamp Act's given to us, so when one's given, we have to take it. So the Stamp Act, which you would probably anyway pick the Stamp Act, but and that's why when you're prepping for this, you always need 3. So if they give you just generic question, you use your 3. And if they give you like one that wasn't one of your 3, you'll have to deal with that one plus, your 2 most important ones. So what are you putting with the Stamp Act? Where are you going with it?
To compare it to the Townsend Duties?
You can do. You can take any of them. So Proclamation Act, Stamp Act, Townsend Duties, Boston Massacre.
And then I'd say Intolerable Acts.
So you're going to take Intolerable Acts and Townsend Duties. Yeah, I would link Intolerable Acts and Quebec Act together because it just allows me to buy more time.
You love the Quebec Act, I've noticed.
I do.
I don't know why.
My professor at university was obsessed with it being the most important. He convinced me. Which is why, like, when it wasn't on the PowerPoints for my students last year in year 12, I was like, oh dear, there's a big gap on my year 13s. Because I went to them, oh yeah, about and of course I think the Quebec Act's the most important, and they don't even know what it was.
They didn't make you suspect that maybe he was wrong.
No.
Okay.
My predecessor was a specialist in medieval crusade history, and my professor is one of the leading professors in American Revolution history in the country. I know who I think has a better grasp of the American Revolution.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Cool. Right. So let's deal. Shall we deal with the Stamp Act? Which would you go? Would you put Intolerable and Quebec? You want Townsend Duties as the third one?
Oh, I mean, I could be persuaded.
Yeah, well, we can debate them all anyways. We've done this a million times. They're on the Unit 2 podcast. They've already got our entire discussion on this, but we can do it briefly again to run through. Because it's this one is a question from the pack, so it's one we've already done. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah. So it says, how far do you agree? It was the most important. Is it just important, or was it the most important?
It's obviously important. It wouldn't even be the question. I mean, they're not going to give you something that's completely useless. So if it's there, it's for a reason. So it's like,
yeah,
it is important. Is it the most important?
Can I give you the 3 reasons I think it is important?
Yeah, go for
it. The most important.
As well. Let's talk about why it's important, and then we can sort of discuss.
Let's see why it's important. But then, if it's most important, we have to compare it to other things.
Yeah, you have to do like they'll have to pick 3. They say why they're important, but they have to pick which one is the most important, and then because they need counter arguments. What are you going to go for most important, by the way?
For most important, I think I would go for the Intolerable Acts.
Yeah, me with the Quebec Act as well. I'm going to lean on the Quebec Act. Yeah, I think they're the most important one.
I've actually changed my view because I used to think that Stamp Act was the most important. But I would never say that, James, especially publicly.
Yeah.
So
important. All right.
So why is the Stamp Act? Sorry.
Why is it important? And then we need to say why the other ones are more important. Yeah, go on.
So I think it's important. It applies to all the colonists, unlike the Sugar Act. That's important. Right. So there are also acts, there's the Sugar Act that.
Well, the Sugar Act technically applies to all the colonies. It's just not going to impact them all.
Yeah, but that's right. Because if you're not dealing with sugar,
it's mostly
affected. Whereas the Stamp Act is a tax on all, like if you buy paper or you write a letter or something, you have to. So the Stamp Act really affects everybody, and it especially affects people who are very literate and like to write pamphlets, right? So
yes.
So that's
because it's on paper, which is
on
lawyers,
paper.
lawyers, newspapers, and all the people you definitely don't want to annoy.
Yeah, I think that that it raised the issue of taxation without representation.
Yeah,
I think that argument takes on a lot of power because of the Stamp Act, and I think that
one of my students flagged out that James Otis talked about no taxation without representation beforehand, but obviously
I know
that's true. But it really gains traction from Patrick Henry.
It gains traction. I didn't say it was first posed, but I said
I'm just saying, just to flag it, because she flagged that. And it is important to notice that Patrick Henry is not the first one to talk about it, but it's the first one to gain kind of traction in the colonies, where everyone kind of knows it becomes famous.
Yeah, and then the last thing I would say is that it was repealed, right? So it was basically a sign of British weakness that could then, that really, I think, enabled things to escalate soon after that.
Yeah.
So I think that the repeal, I mean, that's the Proclamation Act, isn't it? Is that a separate thing?
No, you're thinking of the Declaratory Act.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting this. The Declaratory Act, which isn't there on the table. But the Declaratory Act both reaffirms the authority of Parliament and repeals the Stamp Act.
Yes, right? As we said,
that's
teacher losing their authority in their classroom is the Stamp Act.
While stating in theory what that authority is, which just makes it even weaker, right?
Yeah, and the Declaratory Act is irritating. And I think the Declaratory Act, because they put that Declaratory Act in, they're trying to assert the idea of parliamentary authority. And that obviously is problematic, because I don't think the Townsend duties, if we're going to undermine the Townsend duties when we get to it later, Townsend duties don't get brought in without the Declaratory Act. Because the Townsend duties were done deliberately to prove that the Declaratory Act has teeth when it clearly didn't.
Yeah.
I think other things that are key with the Stamp Act, and I really want to pull up, led to the Stamp Tax Congress, which was the first time all the colonies came together to protest out. And that became although they had come together for the Albany Congress in the War of Austrian Succession, that had been totally useless. So this was the first time they came together and actually did something. And I think that set the base point for what would become the First Continental Congress, after the Intolerable Acts. And it formed the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty are quite important. Tea chuckers. I mean, it's tar and feathering, tea chucking,
while they're dressed as Native Americans.
Samuel Adams comes into being, and it's
they would be cancelled. They would be cancelled today, so they wouldn't.
They would be like the Trump and the Tea Party boss. The Sons of Liberty are basically I
would cancel them.
The Trump shaman would have been all over the Sons of Liberty. He'd have been up there chucking tea.
All right. This is getting out of control, James.
He'd have been up there chucking tea in the harbour. So I think this is really important. And the key thing, I think the reason why there's still support for the colonists between Edward Burke and William Pitt. And as we said before, I don't think the support for the colonists goes until the Boston Tea Party, from the ones who see their position and their points. And it also establishes the position of not willing to use force, because Gates says, if we want to enforce this, we're going to have to send in the army. And they don't. They balk at the idea of using fully despotic powers over the colonists. So I think the key is, I think the Stamp Act is incredibly important. It is the catalyst that sets the ball rolling.
Yeah.
But I think there were still moments afterwards where they could have rolled it back. That's why it's not the most critical one, I think.
Yeah.
It was not the point of no return. But it was definitely the catalyst that set the ball rolling towards the point of no return. And if you're going to make I think the Stamp Act is one you could definitely make the argument that is most important.
That's a mixed metaphor. Can you have a catalyst that sets the ball rolling?
Yeah. If you put explosive thing that then triggers the ball to start rolling.
All right. Okay. Well, I just wanted to check.
Doesn't the catalyst?
I'll pay it. I'll pay that, I suppose.
Yeah, I've had 4 hours sleep. You got to give me some slack.
No quarter.
The Quartering Act coming in on the side.
That's right. Which brings us to the Quartering Act.
Yeah, go on. Yeah. So are we agreeing that Stamp Act is...
What a segue that was.
Stamp Act is at least the second. Do you think it's the second most important?
Yeah,
You persuaded because I've persuaded you that the Intolerable Acts in Quebec Act are really important. You've kind of persuaded me that the Boston Tea Party should be up there higher than I had it before.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, I love this question because literally there's so many damn good answers in this. This is the most interesting question, I think, on this course, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Because every time you look at it, you change your mind. I keep changing my mind.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess you'd have to choose if you don't think it's the most significant, you would have to choose then why that is. What is the most
why is it not most? And that for me, it's like that it's not a point of no return. There's still possibility to bring it back. And I think
so the point of no return.
I actually think the Declaratory Act may even be more important than the Stamp Act itself. Like this, the assertion of it after the repeal is more important than the Stamp Act in the initial point.
Oh, I'm sure about that.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that once Britain doubles down, and starts taking a more aggressive attitude.
Yeah.
All right, so that could be an argument for the Boston Massacre, even.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make it.
My student
Tyrell on a shout out is obsessed with the Boston Massacre being #1. So like, every time someone says the Boston Massacre is important, I just think of him because he went toe to toe with the whole class.
Yeah, and that's fun. And the tour guides in Boston are going to love you for that.
Yeah, but we're
not here for them. So yeah, do you want to go, James? So I think the Intolerable Act. I would say
we go the main one. Okay, cool. Obviously, they would leave the most important one to last, but we can deal with it now, and then we have to decide which other third one we're putting in. We put in the Stamp Act as second most important.
Yeah.
You need a weaker one. All right. So Intolerable Acts, coercive acts. I mean, the Intolerable Acts and Quebec Act will bring in together. I think you can link them because they were passed in the same parliament. If you want to make the question, I think that the Quebec Act pushes the Intolerable Acts, like really puts the ground down for the conflict, and the Quebec Act just tips it over the top. I think the Intolerable Acts are less. I don't think they would have had the same impact without the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act really is like the icing on the cake of the Intolerable Acts that puts the American colonists into the point of no return. So obviously, Intolerable Acts, and I think the reason why you can see the Intolerable Acts and Quebec Act being so important is because the Bill of Rights that they needed to set up the US Constitution is entirely set up to deal with these two acts and what the British did in them. And I think, if you want to look at PTSD style trauma memories that linger into the Americans, you can see it. Like murder trials taken to England, that's lack of habeas corpus, lack of jury of your peers. That's addressed very clearly in the Bill of Rights. So this is the problem because that's despotism. And this is like despotism incarnate. New Quartering Act imposed, again, putting an army in peacetime into the colonies, unacceptable, especially now. And the Quartering Act was a problem under the Townsend duties, but after the Boston Massacre, you've had civilians killed by the army and you want to quarter the army in civilian situations. This is like, asking for trouble. Governor's powers increased instead of the assembly. That's clear despotism and like a flag because for them, the assemblies are the same as parliament. So for them, they're like, you're taking away our literal democratic rights. They do not respect or do not recognize parliament's like authority, and that's clear when they pass when they do the First Continental Congress against this, and the Suffolk resolves against this, they are clearly saying we do not recognize parliament's authority. For them, it's a despotic move. And I think that it brings the other colonies to rally in defense of Boston. Beforehand, they were like, I think before these acts, the other colonies were like, yeah, Boston's a troublemaker. We don't really want to get involved in that. They're causing their own problems. It's their issues. But I think they see this as so despotic and so intolerable. I mean, they called it the Intolerable Acts for a reason. So that the other colonies rally behind them, and it leads to the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress, as we know, is more important in leading to the Second Continental Congress.
Lies. All lies. Don't listen to him.
Lovely segue into the thing. And then the Quebec Act, if you're looking outside, recognized Catholicism as a religion of Quebec. That was never going to fly for the Americans. They were never going to be happy with that because, again, it's that idea of despotism. You're bringing back their biggest fears. Extended the Quebec boundary to include Ohio and Mississippi. You've just taken out the whole West, which brings back, So you've got the Quartering Act, which brings back the Townsend duties. You've got like parliamentary assertion, which brings in the Stamp Act. You've got the Quebec boundary extending, which brings in the Proclamation Act. You know, you've got like Quartering Act, which fears from the Boston Massacre. You've got like, you know, so it's literally like all the biggest hits of all the other ones are being brought back in one go. It's like the greatest hits tour. You know, so westward expansion's gone again, which means they know they're going to be boxed in. And French civil law is retained, no trial, limited trial by jury, which is unacceptable to the British since Magna Carta times. French Canada is in the hands of the royal government with no assembly. So I think, again, they see the Quebec Act, the Intolerable Acts, as the first step towards the Quebec Act, which is the great irony because the Quebec Act was designed to make the French Canadians feel fine, but really made the British Americans think that this was coming for them next. And I think that this really, you know, this was really now where it was like, I think the key point at this moment in time is after the Boston Tea Party, the British government was determined, we are going to assert this right come hell or high water. And the Americans were like, we are going to assert our rights come hell or high water. And I think both sides realize now this was going to be never ending. Britain had to assert that salutary neglect no longer existed and Parliament was superior to the assemblies. And the Americans had to assert the Parliament had no authority over the assemblies were equal and they govern themselves, and salutary neglect is not just a theory but an actual practice of governance. And I think that's why it's the most important, because it just, you know, both sides dug their heels in and went, right, let's do this. And that's where the First Continental Congress comes from, and then Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Second Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence, etc., etc. That's my case.
Agreed. So what's our...
Do you want to add anything to that, or are you going to add anything?
No, I think that's good. I think that's good.
Yeah, you think it's comprehensive? So I persuaded you then that it's most important. Point of no return.
No, James already knew.
You already knew this. You were just toying in our Unit 2 podcast. Where do you want to go for the third one? You want to go Townsend duties?
Could go. I'm thinking. Could we go Townsend duties or the Sugar Act?
You think the Sugar Act is the third most important? Go on, make the case for the Sugar Act.
Third most important? No, just a weaker one. Just why?
No. We should still go. Because you want. This is such a meaty essay. It's so good. You need about 5 hours to write it, though. But I would still go for which you think is the third most. You always want the most important three. You just
okay.
Is the most important. If you've got a really weak one, your counter argument is not going to be very nuanced. It's not going to be very interesting because it's easy to dismiss. You know what I mean? It's a much harder skill to dismiss an argument that is at the same level and requires much better language, which is going to influence the examiner. I think you've got to be way more nuanced. You've got to, but that's why again, I would say you've got to have decided where you are on all these things before you walk in the exam room, because you cannot come up with that level of nuance and consistency all the way through it unless you've already made up your mind where you're going with it.
I agree. I think that's true. All right, let's do the Townsend duties.
You want to do Townsend duties? Okay, cool. And then we'll take the Tea Party. I think the other ones, you could argue the other ones. We have argued the other ones. So we don't need to kill it, batter it to death. Go on, then you make the case for Townsend duties, and I'll make the case for the Boston Tea Party. You make the case for Townsend duties, and I'll counter why not. And then I'll make the case for Boston Tea Party, and you counter why not.
Well, do you want to why don't you give the context?
I'll say Townsend duties.
Townsend duties. So what are they doing?
To argue why it's significant. Okay, yeah, cool. So Townsend duties, why it was important. It was an assertion of the Declaratory Act. So it showed that Parliament was going to continue with this idea that parliamentary superiority over the assemblies, and they were going to enforce it. It led to the Americans rejecting the distinction of internal and external taxes, which was fine, because if they'd have accepted that, this would have gone through, and then maybe it might not have led to the other clashes. The Board of Customs Commissioners was set up in Boston. This is important because it built on the idea of the Vice Admiralty Court and the anti-smuggling legislation that had meant that they now had to pay the actual fines before. Now having it set up made it even more difficult. And New York's assembly was suspended, and the Quartering Act of 1765 was enforced. So New York assembly being suspended is quite important, because that really is Parliament saying we're superior to you, whereas the colonies are not going to recognize. I mean, like I said, for them, Parliament suspending the New York Assembly is like, Massachusetts Assembly suspending the Virginia Assembly. It's like you just don't have the authority. It's like, or literally, I suppose the equivalent today would be like Macron suspending British Parliament. Like, you don't have that authority to do that. But I think it's less important because basically it mostly impacted merchants, and the merchants were more interested in their trade than fighting it. So the resistance was lower. And New York eventually gives in and takes the troops, which shows it wasn't that important. The Vice Admiralty Court already existed, so most of the legacy of the Townsend duties was already in place from 1764. And the merchants
it
didn't
didn't
want to
create,
huh?
yeah, it didn't create such a stir afterwards.
No,
Did
it
it? There was a
didn't.
kind of period of relative
I
peace.
guess the key thing here is when they repealed it again. So it's building on repealing from the Stamp Act, but that precedent had already been in place. When they repealed it, they left in the stupid tax on tea that
That's
led
right.
to the Boston Tea Party. So everything is linked in. Without that tax on tea, you wouldn't have the Boston Tea Party. Without Boston Tea Party, wouldn't have had the tolerable acts. So again, it's all about like, I love this one because the chain of causation is so rich that you can literally like pick any point and make the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like this is truly one of the great questions, I think.
Yeah.
You could write so much. I mean, you know, I mean, I did my entire undergraduate course. The detailed one was just on this time period. That was it. Looking at each act in detail.
James,
Yeah,
you're
go
not
on, make
making
the
it
case
sound
why
very you're not making it sound very attractive. You're yawning.
I'm tired. Make the case. It's because the Townsend duties are so unimportant. They send me to sleep. Go on, no, I make the case. Wake me up by making the case why the Townsend duties are more important.
Well, because I think you said it. I think that it's a catalyst. I think it's a catalyst argument.
Yeah, but if it's a catalyst argument, like, oh yeah, go on, make the case. Why is make the
That's
catalyst?
a catalyst argument for the Tea Party.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah,
that's the idea. But then you could argue that the Tea Party's again. It depends how you frame it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's your weak ass case.
That's my weak ass case.
That's you're not even trying. That's like why is it more important than the others? Can you make the case? I know. I'm going to
Well, for the same reason.
If it's a catalyst argument, then I think the Stamp Act is more of a catalyst because it was first. That would be an easy way to dismiss that, because I think it's building on, because without the Stamp Act you'd have no Declaratory Act. Without the Declaratory Act you have no Townsend duties.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the Stamp Act
is catalyst argument's a little is a little wobbly.
Well, if you go I think the catalyst argument is a good one if you want to go, because it's always going to be catalyst or executor like at the end. But
yeah,
if you're going catalyst argument, you've got to go with the first catalyst. I think the Stamp Act was more of a catalyst than Townsend. I mean, you could make the case for the Proclamation Act, because you could say that it was more important than the Stamp Act, and it was before it. But I don't think you can make the case that the Stamp Act was not a catalyst before the Townsend duties. I think it would be really difficult to do that.
Fair enough.
And then if we're going Boston Tea Party thing, and you convinced me of this, the Boston Tea Party is where the British decided they'd had enough. And I think this is the key point, because I think that transformation from taxation to destruction of property escalated the conflict to the point where Britain had to act. And I think
that's right.
The fact that they lost their supporters in England at this point.
That's right.
Burke and Pitt were not willing to support the destruction of property.
Yeah.
That means without the support in Parliament, the hardliners were more likely to get, the conflict that they wanted.
Yeah, and it's not the fact that the tea, as devastating and traumatic as it is to think about tea being thrown overboard. I mean,
you can't let it go.
I can't let it go. I'm a massive tea drinker.
Yeah.
But even so, I think it's the principle. That's the thing. Destruction of property is it's the principle that British property, no matter if it's relatively minor in the scheme of things, it's the principle that these people can get away with destroying British property. That's really actually very important.
Yeah, it's a different problem. But why is it less important?
Less important than the...
Oh, and it also, I think, the other key thing is without the Boston Tea, the Intolerable Acts are passed as a direct response to the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, so we're talking about catalysts again.
Yeah, so again, the Intolerable Acts don't happen without the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah. You could argue. I mean, I'd be tempted to do the Boston Tea Party
as the most
rather
important.
than Intolerable Acts. Yeah. Yeah, I'd be very open to that.
Because it wasn't even on my radar, and then you convinced me, and it's moved up. Like the intolerable acts, they're so funny because we had different ones, and then we've moved these ones up. I think, yeah, Trump shaman and his Boston Tea Party trucking mates.
Yeah.
Trump would have been all over the Sons of Liberty. He would have been Trump would have been like a less intelligent Samuel Adams.
Oh. Let's leave Trump out of this, shall we? We've got enough on our plate.
With eating cats and
got enough of them. Enough. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I think you could make the case for Boston Tea Party. I'm still going to lean to intolerable acts just for the simple fact that it takes two to tango. That's my opinion in the side bits. Okay. And the intolerable acts, I think, really well. I think the Boston Tea Party is what flips the Brits over the edge. But again, unless the Americans also flipped over the edge, it doesn't happen. And that's where the intolerable acts made sure that both sides were annoyed.
Bravo.
Because they dug their heels in. Because the intolerable acts is the two sides, like stags rutting in a field. Like, let's do this kind of thing, basically.
Yeah.
I think, whereas the Boston Tea Party just sets it up. Yeah. The intolerable acts and the Quebec Act are the rumble in the jungle of the colonial independence.
What have you got this? What is it with you in the mixed metaphors? You've got rutting, you've got a rumble in the jungle. You can't have both. You can't rut in the jungle.
Yeah, it's just like added thing. 4 hours sleep, you slightly delusional. It's like,
all right. I think
Elon Musk's 2 a.m. texts. That's what happens when you don't sleep. Yeah, so I think where are we going? We convinced ourselves that the Tea Party is now more important. We moved it up. So where are we going? Boston Tea Party, Stamp Act, Intolerable Acts is the three. We've kind of
they've
lost their lust.
Let's do that. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Are we still staying with Intolerable Acts, Quebec Act, which is most important? If you separate it out, I'd still go Quebec Act. I still think Quebec Act is more important.
Oh, James, this hobby horse of yours. I would go either. I would go.
When
Boston.
When the Americans declared independence, they said they were more British than the British, and the British had become French. How would they think that if it wasn't for the Quebec Act?
Yeah.
Which one has more influence on the? I think they both, the Intolerable Acts and the Quebec Act, both have a heavy influence on the Bill of Rights. But I would say that the Bill of Rights is also directly aimed at the fear of despotism, because the Quebec Act resurrects the phantom of the long dead French Empire.
Yeah, true.
And it cuts them off on the West. Don't underestimate that loss of Western land.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you can make a
self-interest.
Make a convincing case for it.
Yeah. Well, it's just recreating, because I think the Quebec Act recreates the Proclamation Act as well. Shuts off the Western expansion.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right, cool. So I think you can argue any which way. I think this is a beautiful question. I love this question, but it's incredibly complex. You could write fucking millions of paragraphs on this.
Yeah.
It's a rich question. It's by far the best bit of the course. I think the most interesting in terms of where do you go with it? Okay, cool. So we've recorded this.
All right.
Let's send it to the students, see what they think, and then we'll do next week with the other ones.
Okay. Do you want to stop?